For Indigenous peoples as well here on Turtle Island to be in solidarity and to like not just be allies, not just be co-conspirators, but to be relatives and to take this fight and the struggle on as our own.
The Electronic Intifada.
The Electronic Intifada.
The Electronic Intifada.
This is the Electronic Intifada podcast. I'm Nora Barrows-Friedman.
And I'm Asa Winstanley.
Welcome back to the Electronic Intifada podcast. I'm Nora Barrows-Friedman. On March 30th, which is Land Day in Palestine, the NDN Collective released their position paper, The Right of Return is Landback, which they say names their deep commitment to their Palestinian relatives and emphasizes why Indian country should also stand for Palestinian liberation. Joining us to talk about this is Krystal Two Bulls, Demetrius Johnson, and Nadya Tannous of the NDN Collective. Thank you all for being with us today on the Electronic Intifada podcast.
Thanks for having us, Nora.
Yes, thank you.
Yeah, what's up, everyone?
Well, Krystal, let's start with you. You're the campaign director for Landback with the NDN Collective. The position paper begins with an outline of parallel histories of settler colonialism on this continent and in Palestine, and 3.5 centuries after the genocide of Indigenous peoples on this continent began by European colonists. It talks about the 1830 Indian Removal Act, which was a measure that was, as the paper says, designed to cut relationships Native peoples had with the land by removing us, destroying our homes, our medicines, our crops, our livestock, and killing any who resisted. Since the passing of the Indian Removal Act and U.S. expansion out west, the popular Wild West trope began, where settlers positioned themselves as saviors and us as savages. And of course, this is so incredibly similar to the Zionist colonization plans and practices of legalized forced removal of Palestinians from their land. Can you talk about the significance of connecting these histories of colonial violence and the purpose of the Palestine position paper?
Yeah. First, thank you for the introduction, and I'm really excited to be here. But our campaign is only 2.5 years old. We're still a relatively new movement. We're a relatively new campaign, but I think from day one, whenever we launched the campaign, I knew that we would deepen our relationship with Palestine. I knew that would be a priority for us. And I knew it was something that we would center in our campaign. And the reason, one, is obviously from my personal relationships and connections, with Palestinian aunties who had invested in me and taught me friendships with Nadya and, those ties, but also, larger than all of that is also the fact that, and we name this in the position paper of settler colonialism has a playbook. Yeah. And our oppressors, they communicate with each other. They collaborate with each other, they communicate, they work across, right? And so for us as peoples who are targeted by settler colonialism, it's important that we also communicate, that we also collaborate, that we also build together, and that we know the histories, and that we understand, the various different timelines that exist with settler colonialism, right? So our peoples are 500 plus years into this, and we're still resisting, we're still fighting, we're still holding on to our ways, our cultures, our language, our spirituality, and we're still fighting to reclaim our relationship with the land. And so I think that when we're talking about Palestine being 74 years into settler colonialism, and we're seeing an escalated oppression, right? Moving straight into an apartheid state. And so I think it's important that we look at that, because when Palestinians go home, that means us as Indigenous peoples here on Turtle Island, we are then closer to what our vision of sovereignty and liberation and freedom is, right? And so I think that it's not this separate movement. It's not a separate thing that we're focusing on, or what some may think is this different struggle that's over there, out there, but it's actually something that's very close to home. We know what that process was like. We survived all of that. And now watching our siblings go through those processes as well, it is our responsibility to show up. It is our responsibility to say, hey, this is how it played out with us. This is what happened with us. We don't have to do these things again. We can actually just like cut straight to what we need to cut to. So I think that it's key for Indigenous peoples as well here on Turtle Island to be in solidarity and to like not just be allies, not just be co-conspirators, but to be relatives and to take this fight and the struggle on as our own. In the position paper, that's the intention that we've woven through the entire piece.
Thank you. Nadya, tell us a little bit about the process of putting this position paper together and how you've been working across Turtle Island, the present day US, with Native communities to strengthen and solidify these important bonds, not just, theoretically, but in practice.
Yeah, so I think I'll start with how I ended up at the Landback campaign as a Landback organizer. It really is through personal relationships. Krystal and I actually started to organize with each other at Standing Rock, but we never met in person. And then we ended up meeting in Peñasco, New Mexico, about a year later.
Yeah.
It just, things developed, right? Because part of the commitment is, like you said, not just to have an analysis around what Indigenous sovereignty and liberation looks like and what our responsibility is as people who live on this land, and also as people who have been dispossessed and are actively being dispossessed by the same monsters and same systems, the same imperialist force, but to really confront US imperialism from the first front line, which is Native communities. That's where the US military was developed. And without the United States military marauding against Krystal's people, against Demetrius's people, we would not have US imperialism. And so I think, Demetrius and I also go way back. Demetrius was one of the delegates on the Palestinian Youth Movement's Indigenous Youth Delegation to Palestine. And so we met back when the PYM and Red Nation were collabing. And so I take that really seriously because it means that those commitments and kind of your reference points are driven by the needs and the demands of the people that you know and the communities that they come from. We are all grassroots organizers who are deeply invested and committed with our home communities or to our home communities. So in terms of coming to the Landback campaign, I think the Landback is a people's demand, right? NDN Collective and the campaign is a facet of that, being able to actually carry that. We're able every day to come to our work from being grassroots organizers to now being able to try and think about what it means to be accountable to the front line, what it means to be able to resource Landback struggles, like the one where you and I live, Nora, the West Berkeley Shell Mound, for example, right? And so many struggles that are happening across Turtle Island. So in terms of the paper, it was pretty natural coming into the Landback campaign, as Krystal said, she had really prioritized Palestine and talking about how this needed to be focused on, this needed to be actively built out as part of the ongoing and natural and intentional reciprocal process between movements. And that process, as the paper lays out, between the historic commitments and the historic relationships between Indigenous liberation movements and Palestinian movements in the spirit of internationalism and in the spirit of global Indigenous solidarity. And I think this was the second paper. Our first paper was Demilitarism is Decolonization, or Demilitarization is Decolonization, really tackling militarism and militarization within Indigenous communities and around the world, right? And I think, one of my favorite stories that we uplifted and something that I also think this paper gives back a lot to Palestinian communities is some of the history that we maybe don't talk about or don't know about, but stories that I learned when the Palestinian Youth Movement's delegations went to Standing Rock, and we were taught by, Lakota elders. When we showed up, we were like, where the heck have y'all been? And we were like, wait, you guys know us? Like, what do you mean?
Yeah.
And they were like, yeah, y'all showed up here, then we haven't seen you in a while. We're like, oh my God. And it's that story of the Palestinian movement, right, and Palestinian leaders coming to Standing Rock specifically for the first International Indigenous Treaty Council, and really thinking through what it meant to try and utilize different strategies for liberation. One of them is the United Nations Declaration for the Rights of Indigenous People, and looking at the United Nations as one mechanism for liberation, you know, as a tool, right, in the larger movement. Even as we as Palestinians don't use it, you know, on an international level, we invested in developing out that strategy for our siblings and with our siblings based off of our experiences. Mm-hmm. So I wanted to uplift that because I think that's the spirit of this paper. It's not transactional. It really is stepping in what it means to be a good relative, what it means to be a principled in a principled struggle, and what it means to uplift, to know, and to unite with each other.
Thank you. Demetrius, I want to pull you into the conversation as well. Can you tell us a little bit about your work with the NDN Collective and the Landback movement, and what you feel are maybe some of the most key or significant points in this paper?
Yeah, so, you know, me and Nadya got hired, you know, within a week of each other. And so to me, like, you know, the Landback movement, I've learned from memers. You know, I was involved in the meme community for a little bit. I was talking with some First Nation homies, some Indigenous youth, and yeah, that's like, you know, they kind of popularized like what Landback means. And so for me, like coming into this campaign, it kind of already had like my own like idea of like what Landback means. I mean, it's like not a complicated definition. It's just literally just like, you know, give us the land back, all the land back.
Yes, all the land. Yeah.
But, you know, NDN Collectives, you know, the history of like how this campaign came to be, you know, started from right here where we're at right now, Haysapa, and, you know, protecting this land and protecting that sacred site, the Black Hills. And, you know, I remember like, because I've been a part of the Red Nation for 7 years now. And, you know, kind of just like, you know, watching other like Indigenous movements and like keeping an eye on NDN Collective and actually seeing like that action go down live. That was like my first like connection or like, you know, like who is Krystal Two Bulls? And I just see her just like on top of a vehicle, just like shouting. And like, you see like Nick Tilson and I don't know, like just seeing like the origins of like where this Landback campaign came from. And finally, like, I never, you know, me personally, I never met Krystal or talked with Krystal really until like my interview for this position. And, you know, just actually seeing like, you know, the living legend, but also under like you know, Krystal telling me, oh, like we're actually thinking of getting Nadya on the team too. And I was like, what, Nadya? Like the crew's coming together, like what a squad. But no, like you know, NDN Collective's Landback campaign, that is like the cornerstone of like what we're organizing around, like actually like why we're here, is, you know, the reclamation of Haysapa. And that's like the main thing that we're, you know, focused on. And like from there, like we believe like it's gonna blow up. Like if we can reclaim Haysapa, if we can reclaim the Black Hills, like that opens up so many other doors and avenues for, you know, other Indigenous people to reclaim their sacred sites.
Yeah.
But, you know, other than that, like, you know, we got our narrative, which, you know, right now we're working on our Landback magazine. Hopefully be released by the end of this year. That's like the goal we're going towards, Indigenous Peoples Day. So keep an eye out, which will be about Haysapa. Our political education, which Nadya upholds, or both of us really kind of like, that's like our main like bread and butter work. Nadya does our Landback U. It's like an online platform. It's a free online educational platform talking about, you know, like different struggles around Turtle Island, off Turtle Island, and how, you know, grassroots and frontline communities are, you know, reclaiming land, or, you know, what all that means for the people doing that work. And alongside with the Landback U work is our position papers, which is this is one of them. And also like, we resource our frontline communities, we do movement support, and also our Landback agenda. It's another piece of work that we're, another reason why we're here, just, delving into like, how do we, how do we get land back through education, through resistance, through like mobilization, but also how do we do it like on different fronts? Because there's a bunch of different ways, a bunch of different tactics that you can use to get land back. And like, we're not trying to be what do you call it, like a one-trick pony out here. But my involvement in this position paper really came from my long, well, I don't know if that's long, but just me being like in this movement space for the past 7 years with the Red Nation, and a lot of political education, a lot of understanding of what the Palestinian resistance means to Indigenous people. And then it wasn't until 2018 where I was in connection with Nadya and the Palestinian youth movement. They're like, hey, like, we're trying to get someone from Red Nation to go on a delegation to Palestine, like who's down to go? And the Red Nation was just like, this guy's going. So I don't know, like up until that point, like I didn't understand, like it's a whole different realization when like you're just like some res kid from Ganado, like, and you just read about, what is happening around the world, but you're kind of just like within like your own backyard, within like your own little bubble.
Mm-hmm.
But when you actually see like what's happening globally, what's happening to other Indigenous people, and making those connections, because my connections really came from like landscape. When we first landed in Tel Aviv and went to our hostel, it was like midnight, it was like 1 o'clock in the morning. But just driving around and like seeing like, oh, like people just like stopped in the intersections, just yelling at each other, just like asking like what like, how's the family been, like where are you going, like do you need directions? And seeing like packs of like little res dogs just walking around, just like they, I don't know, it was literally just like home. Like these are the same sights and sounds and landscapes like I see at home. So I felt like no disconnection, and I actually felt really comfortable just being like on the other side of the world, never traveled internationally, never even really taken a flight. And I was just like, wow, like this is eye-opening, but also, just it's really inspiring too. Knowing that the care and the history and the connections that our Palestinian relatives have taken in educating not only themselves, but like, the people here on Turtle Island. And I don't know, I think that's like what we really wanted to like weave into the paper too, is, like how would we explain this issue to our relatives? How would we explain this issue to our grandmas, our cousins, our uncles, our aunties? Like that's who we really wanted to gear this paper for. But I think,
yeah, that's beautiful. And I do want to ask you, more about your experience on the ground in Palestine in a moment, but I want to go back to you, Krystal. Tell us a little bit about, well, I want to talk about the Palestinian right of return and the Landback movement and how they are two, sides of the same sphere. What is the Landback movement, and how, like when you say yes, all the land, this like immediate automatic vilification by the settler state around that, and the extraordinary panic that settlers and the people in power kind of express about that, which is exactly what we see in Palestine when we talk about the right of return. So can you talk a little bit about the Landback movement and really its kind of practical implications and applications, and how it's connected to the Palestinian right of return?
Yeah, man, so that's the whole paper. Summarize the whole paper out here, but in terms of like what is Landback, I think that's always like a really good starting point for conversations. And I think, Landback is the literal reclamation of land, right? And it's also the reclamation of everything stolen from us when we were forcibly removed, right? And so that means acknowledging that we were fully thriving economies and societies and communities pre-colonization. And so when we're talking about land back, you know, with the land also comes the reclamation of like ceremony and language and culture, spirituality, but also like governance systems, kinship systems, how we relate to each other, education, food security, healthcare, housing, all of these things centered on our relationship to the land. And so when we're talking about land back, we're talking about reclaiming all of those things. And those things were specifically targeted and severed for a reason, right? Like by design. Everything that we are experiencing in our communities to this day, the high rates of diabetes, the high rates of like high school dropout, suicide, drug and alcohol abuse, violence, domestic abuse, all of these things, they all have a root. And all of them go back, and I could probably spend a lot of time going through each one of those things and tracing it back to when we were forced to remove from the land. It all started then, and that's by design. You know, there's intention put into that. And so if there's going to be a social justice movement anywhere on these lands, then it has to start with land back. That is the root. That is how this so-called country was founded. And so that's what land back represents. It represents reclaiming relationship, reclaiming the land, reclaiming who we are. Ultimately, at the end of the day, that's what it is. That's all of those things are who we are. So it makes us who we are. But it's also a reckoning, and it's also claiming justice, right? And so for us, that's what we're working towards with land back. You know, and through our campaign, we do have like a heavy focus and emphasis on like public lands, right? Because we know that national parks were not created for general public use and to save this pristine landscape the way that they like to push out in their narratives. But we know that national parks were created to strategically keep Native peoples from their land. Every national park that exists right next to a nation that exists, a fully thriving people. And that land was strategically placed in a national park to keep us from that. And so we do have a focus on public lands. But that doesn't mean that land back doesn't also include private owned lands, church owned lands, military owned lands, because those two are the largest landowners in the world, not just here in the so-called US, the world, right? The Catholic Church and the military. And so thinking about that, you know, there are those that, organize in that way, you know, and we see many different ways to reclaim land. You know, it's happening through legislation, it's happening through occupation, nonviolent direct action, through lawsuits, through purchasing land, through gifting of land, co-ops are being created, land trusts are being created, land taxes, you know, and like even like co-management, which is not land back, but it is a door that's opening towards land back, right? Renaming of places and spaces is not land back, but it moves us in that direction, right? And so, you know, we're seeing land back happen in many different ways, and there is no one template for that. But I think the way that it applies is that's the exact same thing happening in Palestine, is that disconnection from culture, from spirituality, from our four-legged relatives, from the plants, from the languages, all of those things. It's a very specific way of being targeted that separates and severs that relationship, right? And then the hope is that, you know, colonizers can come in and just like lay over the top of all of the things that existed before and just like prop up a so-called country, you know? And so I think that that's the connecting piece, is that we see the same process. And so earlier when I said that settler colonialism has a playbook, we've seen this play before. And so now that we've seen it, when we collaborate and we work together, then we can address that, you know, and we can adjust tactic, we can adjust strategy, and we can build together and show up for each other in a way that prevents the levels of harm, right? And the generations that my peoples have had to experience trauma, right, to get us to this point here today. And so, yeah, those are the connecting pieces. And yeah, so when we're looking at right of return, that's exactly what right of return is asking for, is the same exact thing that land back is asking for.
Right. I mean, talking about the national parks here in the so-called US, I mean, Nadya and I both know intimately how the Israeli Lands Authority, they call it, and the Jewish National Fund worked together to, not only like ethnically cleanse Palestinian villages, entire areas and regions of Palestine, but then they, literally planted forests on top of the ruins of villages and called it a national park in order to somehow prevent not just like the return to that land, but the memory, the historical legacy of the people who were there, just a generation before. It's astounding. Nadya, what can you say about the delegation that you took Demetrius on and other Native people? And what was it like for you as a Palestinian American, on this delegation of Indigenous folks?
Yeah, so the Indigenous Youth Delegation to Palestine was developed out of work that PYM had been engaging in across Turtle Island really since our inception as a United States chapter, right, in the Bay Area. And we learned a lot, through our Black Mesa delegation to Black Mesa in 2013, 2012, 2013. And then, moving into local landback struggles. When we went to Standing Rock, we made that commitment to be on the ground from, I think the first delegation we sent was in August. And so we were on the ground and made the commitment to be there from September all the way till the end, whenever it would be there. We said 7 months, we can commit to 7 months. When we proposed the Indigenous Youth Delegation, we actually were talking with Krystal. Megan Awad and I were talking with Krystal about what it looks like to actually do this, right? So saying, okay, it's never enough, right? But we're taking our responsibility, we're trying, right? To say, what does it mean for Palestinians to show up on the front line? What does it mean for Palestinians to show up in following the lead of our Indigenous relatives and siblings here in order to, not just say, yes, okay, we're living here in exile on stolen land, but to really take up the responsibility of what I think and what I was taught it means to be Palestinian, which is that we fight injustice wherever we are. We don't just fight for ourselves, right? That's in our practice, that's in who we are, that's in how we've struggled. And so I feel really lucky to come from a people who we have a history of internationalism. We carry that with such pride. And of course, we also, have to take up the responsibility in order to step into that, right? Can't just say it. You have to think about it and do it, right? So that's what the Indigenous Youth Delegation was about. We've been here hosted on these lands, right? And with people, what does it mean to take Indigenous youth from Turtle Island in the Kingdom of Hawaii home with us? What does it mean for us to literally try to live and build with each other? What we ran into were some difficulties. One was grassroots funding. The entire delegation, as with any PYM project, is 100% grassroots funded. And plane tickets to, Lid Airport, so-called Tel Aviv, is tough, right? And we also ran into the structural issues of oppression that Native people live under every day. The issues of passports, for example, the issue of previous incarceration and strange fines that prevented people from leaving the so-called country. A lot of things came up as a barrier, but in the end, the way that we planned it, put it all together, it worked out. And I think the funny thing is, Nora, I have only been to Palestine at that point 5 times in my life, right? And 3 of them were from when I was little. And at that point, the last time I had been was in 2013, and the time before that was the second Intifada, when I was there on the ground as a child. And so when we went in 2018, I have a really good memory, and I really had the responsibility of kind of directing us. And it was interesting how much I remembered. And I think people were like, oh, how many times, so you've been here a lot. I'm like, guys, I grew up in exile. Like, I'm born in Oakland, California. Like, Ohlone territory. Like, I've been in exile my whole life. And there's a reason I've had to go back by myself, because I'm in my immediate family. I'm one of the only ones who can go back. And that's always contingent, as you know, based on the Israeli military authority. And so what it was like for me and for the other Palestinians from the Palestinian youth movement who were also delegates on the trip, it was extremely powerful. That delegation has stuck with us, and it will continue to inform our existence for the rest of our lives. And what it also did was it helped us as the Palestinian youth movement figure out and try to build out an infrastructure for what it looks like to actually engage in principled and transformative joint struggle. And so that's what has happened, trying to really delve into these things. And I think it was, lastly, really transformative for Palestinians on the ground to meet Indigenous peoples from Turtle Island and the Kingdom of Hawaii. There's a story that is one of my favorite stories from the delegation, where we were in Dehesha refugee camp, and we were walking, right? And this mob of kids came, and they were like so excited, right? And they're like all sizes, all ages, and they're just talking with us. I'm like, and I'm trying to translate, like we're all trying to translate from just asking all these questions. And this boy, I think he was like 14, he came up to Demetrius and he was like, I know you guys. And right? And I was like, what do you mean you know these guys? It's like, I know you guys. He's like, this is what happened. And he started just listing off history, mostly about the Lakota struggle, actually. And he just started going off. He's like, and on the plains, this is what happened. And this is the thing with Custer. He's going off, right? And I'm like, how do you know this? He's like, oh, my dad has a book in Arabic in his library. And so I sat and I read it. And I said, have you ever been to Turtle Island? He's like, I've never left Dehesha. Not once, right? Never left this place. And it was that power of knowing that, like, Krystal has never been to Palestine, and knowing that there's that strength in not having to see it for yourself to know it intrinsically. And so I think that's another power, is being able to actually fight for something, and for something that most people think is already lost, right? Landback. Well, just give it up, because it's a struggle that's already been lost. Or Palestine, freeing Palestine from the river to the sea, full return of every Palestinian to the land, and the full return of the land to every Palestinian, right? It's lost, give it up. But what we can see, actually, is that Landback is happening more and more every day. There are more cases of Landback every single month. And so, and we come from Landback organizers. Landback is as old as our people have been resisting from the time the first settlers stepped on our lands. That's what it is. And so we know that the right of return, regardless of the fragmentation, regardless of the difficulties that we have in the Palestinian movement, as is any community, we know that the right of return is a central demand, and the right for full return and full liberation is a central demand that we will never give up for anybody. No matter what, it is not negotiable. Just as the Black Hills are not for sale, and they will never be for sale, right? Because it's the center, the land convenes who we are. And in all honesty, Palestine is a political struggle. Our struggle is for our political rights, not just our human rights, but the struggle is deeply connected to the land. We're not fighting for Palestine to exist in the sky. We're not fighting for us to be able to exist as a shattered people across the world, living for generations in refugee camps, living for generations in exile with the hope that we get absorbed into some settler colonial nation to become American. We're fighting for our dignity and for the full return of ourselves to ourselves. That's what we're fighting for. And so just to say, I think the Indigenous Youth Delegation was extremely powerful, because every single delegate who came felt like they were home and felt like they were welcomed and felt like they knew something intimately already that they were bringing it there. So the last thing I'll say is Yaqub Ode, elder and a leader from the village of Lifta. Yeah. He looked at Malia Hulaman at the end of our tour with him, and he said, don't worry, and don't give up. The land will come back. It's already on its way. Don't worry about them. And he's 90 something years old and he's still fighting, you know, he's still fighting. So we just also uplift our elders like Yaqub Ode, Madonna Thunderhawk, who have been fighting and have been teaching us what it means to hold these slogans and to hold these movements and to let nobody compromise their principles.
Oh, it's beautiful. Thank you, Nadya. Demetrius, I could see you're getting a little emotional about, Nadya talking about what happened in Dheisheh. Can you tell us a couple of other kind of moments of that trip and how it has helped inform and catalyze the work that you and Krystal are doing?
Yeah, I don't know, just like that specific part about, that kid. Well, first of all, like I used to be like a football coach before even I got like politicized. Like I just always loved sports, always loved like working with the kids. I wanted to be a teacher, but I don't know, just something about like, this kid, like, telling me like this history, like I had to learn like throughout college, because they don't teach it in high school or middle school or whatever. Like I had to learn this in college. And this, he's a little guy. Nadya says he's 14, but I was like, he's like 11, he's like 10, like he's a baby, but he's just telling me like all this, all this history, and like the fact that he's just like, yeah, but I've never left this place, but I know about you guys. Like, oh man, like, yeah, that's like our connection, someone who I've never left the Southwest. I've always lived in either in Arizona or in New Mexico. And so just kind of hearing that, I was just like, man, like there's something there. And I just think of my little cousins too. I think of my nephews, my nieces, like they're the same way. Like they also really never left their like communities. But man, oh my gosh, there's like so much. Like every time me and Nadya like get together, like we just always reminisce too. Like just that delegation was really just something else. I think one of my favorite parts was obviously the food. Oh my gosh, the food. So we go to Batir. Oh my gosh. So the Batir's like the place, like they just have like gardens, like just gardens and just vegetables and crops, and like they're just growing like food everywhere. Like, but there's like this little restaurant, right? Like after we get this whole tour of this beautiful place and talking about like, like, oh, like this is actually the place like they just could not capture, because like it was just like so strategic, but like they were really smart. And like they were very clever. Like they made themselves bigger than like what they actually, what they actually were. Like they just like had lights in like all these houses. Like they had like clothes just hanging there. Like they just like, oh, there's like a whole ass army here. Like let's not mess with these guys. Like, and like it worked. And
there were like 11 people holding it down. And he said they didn't even wear the clothes. They just kept washing them and putting them on the line.
And like, I don't know, like, and like, I've never seen like a more beautiful garden in my life. I've never tasted, I mean, okay, so confession, I don't like vegetables, but Palestinian vegetables, I was eating tomatoes, I was eating cucumbers, I was eating everything they were throwing at me, because I've never had anything more like delicious in my life. But I'm telling you, like, so anyways, like Batir at the end, like, we're walking through the villages, we're walking through the gardens, we're going up and down everywhere. Like we're exploring this whole place. And then there's like this little restaurant. And like, I don't know, they just like, they have like bottles of just like drinks. Like, okay, cool. You bring out like this huge, just like giant pan, and it has like, I don't know, like 8 chickens, like 8 whole chickens on it. and there's two of these things. So there's like 16 chickens, right? And it's just like laid like on a bed of just like rice and like, I don't know, some sort of sauce, like some vegetables in there. But then they also had like the little plates all around the table. And I was just like, there's only like 8 of us or 10 of us. Like how, like, I was like doing my part. I was carrying the team on my back. I ate like 2 chickens. Like I was like eating like half that rice, but my goodness, like the food.
Yeah.
And just, but you know, that also just goes into like the hospitality of like, you know, Indigenous people, like everywhere I went, and me being like a resident within, you know, so-called Albuquerque, which is Tiwa territories, the Pueblo people there, you know, they have feast days. You know, it's like a day where they open up their homes, they open up their communities to everyone, people that they know, and they invite people in, and it's literally the same thing.
Mhm.
They feed everyone that comes, they show them around the community, they show them the dances, the prayers, and you know, everyone eats together. And that's just a whole day of just, you know, just welcoming you to our space, and you know, just having like that, you know, relationship, just being good relatives, really. So I don't know, like just like that part really stuck with me. But there was also one other part, and then I'll end it there. But oh gosh, it was, I always feel bad now. I always have to ask you, but it's the place with the school.
Yeah, it was Al Naqab, right? When we went near Al Araqib to the medicine processing plant, right, to their village.
Yep, it was, it was a Bedouin village, and just talking to them, and you know, going to the school, and like this school's been like demolished like I don't know how many times, but they keep rebuilding it. And you know, like just them like wanting to have like education, or just like, you know, fighting to like educate themselves, even though like
this was Khan al Ahmar actually.
Oh, okay.
With the school. Yeah, we went to Khan al Ahmar during the camp, during the resistance and the upkeep. Sorry, we went a lot of places in those days.
And you know, just going around, and I was like, I don't know, like the infrastructures are just like the way people are just like so resilient, or like they just like make do with what they have. And you know, there's places that look like my grandma's house. I mean, you know, people will call it like a shack or just like a rundown home, but like it's not. Like it's a home. Like even though like if it's put together with like plywood or like tarp or whatever, like, you know, those are the same upbringings I grew up with. That's my grandma's house. And we don't think it's run down. Like it's actually well kept. It's a place. It's our home. It's where my belly button's buried. Like it's home. But also like, you know, there's like this in the middle of the village. It's just like this, you know, the sheep and the goats. And they're just like in there, like they're just like doing their thing, but it's like the sheep corral and the goat, like it looked exactly the same, because it's just like little barbed wire, or like I don't know, just like little pieces of like scrap wood, just to create like a corral, right? But and like I don't know, like all my Danette homies will get it, all the people that have like sheep, but like, you know, on the sheep corral, right there, like right on the top corner of the sheep corral is a Wi-Fi router. And I was just like, we're out here, like
gotta have internet.
I mean, like we ain't got internet. We hardly get electricity, like just being honest.
But y'all have Wi-Fi.
Yeah, but y'all got Wi-Fi, like man. Yeah, these sheep out here watching Netflix. Like, oh man,
I love it. I love it.
I don't know, like those are the things like I held on to like the most, like, you know, it is home, and it is rowdy, and it is like, you know, kind of just like I don't know what the word is, just like it can be like overwhelming, but also like it's just like the people that make it feel like home. It's the people that, you know, like bring everything together, and that's exactly what it is like back in Ganado. Like, you know, people say like it's like out in the middle of nowhere, like there's like nothing really out there, but it's like the people, it's your relatives, it's the family that really make it like a really special place. But yeah,
that's beautiful.
That's
and our executive director's father's family is from Batir, and his mother's from Lifta, so I know that that he'll be happy to hear your experiences in those places. Krystal, what have been some of the reactions and also like calls to action, ways that Indigenous folks are already using the position paper, and what are the next steps in meeting these demands that you've all laid out?
Oh man. So, I mean, reactions were definitely overall from Indigenous communities were supportive. I mean, and I think people, even some of the responses that we had conversations with folks and we're like, we need to prepare you for backlash, right? And like, we were very aware of that from the start. And so we were really protective of our whole organization and like did a lot of groundwork and prepping ourselves and bracing people for it, all of that. And then we would have conversations with folks who we thought we really needed to support and kind of bring along. And they were like, well, of course. they were just like, yeah, it makes sense. Like that's the natural thing. And I think for the most part, that has been the response, is that Native folks here are just like, well, yeah, like that's what we went through. And then when you lay out the history and the parallels that exist, they're like, yeah, that just makes sense, And so I think that overall has been the response. I also think like we're treading, I don't know if it's like necessarily new territory, but I think we're moving into a space, and a path that has been less traveled around indigeneity and acknowledging Palestinian peoples as Indigenous siblings to us, right? And I think that we're moving into that space, and like we say who our relatives are. Like we don't wait for the state to say who we are and who we're connected to and who we're related to. We don't wait for the state to say who is who and what our identities are. We define that. And so I think like that is a big thing that, we're stepping into, and that we're pushing, and we're not standing down from that. Our organization has stepped into many coalitions and spaces where we are actively supporting and like calling for, different organizations to not take trips to apartheid states. We're calling for the defunding of different spaces that fund these things. And the ironic thing is that we didn't receive the amount of Zionist backlash that we thought we would. And I think it's because we're a different kind of group. It's a very different thing right now. And so we're sitting with all of that, we're exploring it. And in terms of next steps, like we're continuing to go and to find ways to put the paper into action, right? Like, I think we're still kind of in that like after period of like interviews and conversation and like really diving into that. But our organization is already making some pretty large commitments. And I can't name a whole lot of things publicly, but we have some pretty big commitments that are rolling out soon. And so, we're here, we're not backing down, we're not going anywhere, and we're committed to this work, and like we see each other that way. And so I think that, yeah, there's big next steps, and there's some smaller steps in terms of like building with each other, being in coalition with each other, having some tangible calls to actions, things like that. And we're doing the legwork of meeting that together. And I think as we go deeper, we will even explore like what are the various different tactics and strategies around reclaiming land, and how does that look, and what does that look like in the international movement space, right? And so we're in those conversations, we're still exploring all of that. We're seeing, trying to take our experience and knowledge and see how it applies, what doesn't work, what does work. So I'd say that's kind of where we are right now, and we're not going anywhere. I think that as we went on with this process, like our organization and individuals in our organization, we're about 60 people in our organization who are politicized at varying different degrees. But I will say that the impact that doing this paper has left with each individual in our organization has been powerful. And I see a level of commitment from folks I did not expect it from. And I see them really stepping into this work too. In feeling, right? Not just like knowing, like strategically, tactically, this makes sense, but they feel it. And they're moving with that. And so, yeah, I would say there's a lot of work to be done still, but we're not going anywhere. We're here for it.
That's phenomenal. And where can people, we're going to put the link up, obviously, to, on the post that accompanies this episode. But if people want to learn more about the NDN Collective, about PYM, about Red Nation, where can they go?
Yeah, so for NDN Collective, just indiancollective.org, but the Landback campaign, we have our own website, landback.org. All the things that we're working on are on there. Landback U registrations on there. Some of our past presentations, our modules are on there. Our position papers are all on the NDN Collective website. So you can go to either indiancollective.org or landback.org.
And we actually have the blog of the right of return as Landback position paper going up in Arabic sometime very soon, along with resources on Standing Rock that are written in Arabic for the Arabic speaking audience and for people back home to be able to read it, digest it, and talk about this paper. For Palestinian Youth Movement, follow PYM socials, Palestinian Youth Movement. You'll see us. We got louder and louder every year, alhamdulillah.
That's great. And Red Nation.
Yeah, and then for Red Nation, we got our website, therednation.org, or you can also follow us on our social medias at the Red Nation Movement.
Wonderful. Well, this has been a phenomenal discussion. I expect this is just the first of many. I am so grateful for all three of you joining us today on the Electronic Intifada podcast, Krystal Two Bulls, Demetrius Johnson, and Nadya Tannous of the NDN Collective's Landback campaign. And thank you so much for all that you do. And we'll have you back on very soon.
Thanks for having us, Nora.
Yes, thank you, Nora.
Thank you. Take care.
Thanks for watching this video. Please subscribe to our YouTube channel, hit like, leave a comment. These engagements help us with the YouTube algorithm and it helps us to get around Silicon Valley censorship as much as possible. It does make a difference. You can also support our journalism by going to electronicintifada.net and clicking on donate now. Thank you.